Bienvenidos una vez más a su clase de inglés. Hoy estaremos viendo una clase muy especial, en la cual estaremos aprendiendo a conversar utilizando 4 tipos de estructuras para crear oraciones y frases en inglés sin problema alguna, y así, podrás crear oraciones, y podrás expresarte en inglés con facilidad y claridad. Así que prepara tu cuaderno y tu lápiz y anota aquellas estructuras que aún no conocías. Te dejaré las 4 estructuras en la descripción del video. Y sin más que decir, empecemos. Deberías comer sano.
You should eat healthy.
You should eat healthy.
You should eat healthy.
Deberíamos ir ahora.
We should go now.
We should go now.
We should go now.
Deberían estudiar más.
They should study more.
They should study more.
They should study more.
Ella debería llamarlo.
She should call him.
She should call him.
She should call him.
Él debería intentarlo de nuevo.
He should try again.
He should try again.
He should try again.
Deberías tener cuidado.
You should be careful.
You should be careful.
You should be careful.
Deberíamos llegar pronto.
We should arrive soon.
We should arrive soon.
We should arrive soon.
Deberían irse temprano.
They should leave early.
They should leave early.
They should leave early.
Ella debería beber agua.
She should drink water.
She should drink water.
She should drink water.
Él debería hacer ejercicio a diario.
He should exercise daily.
He should exercise daily.
He should exercise daily.
Deberías dormir más.
You should sleep more.
You should sleep more.
You should sleep more.
Deberíamos hacer planes.
We should make plans.
We should make plans.
We should make plans.
Deberían relajarse esta noche.
They should relax tonight.
They should relax tonight.
They should relax tonight.
Ella debería tomar apuntes.
She should take notes.
She should take notes.
She should take notes.
Él debería caminar a casa.
He should walk home.
He should walk home.
He should walk home.
Deberías confiar en ti mismo.
You should trust yourself.
You should trust yourself.
You should trust yourself.
Deberíamos evitar el conflicto.
We should avoid conflict.
We should avoid conflict.
We should avoid conflict.
Deberían visitar a la familia.
They should visit family.
They should visit family.
They should visit family.
Ella debería cocinar la cena.
She should cook dinner.
She should cook dinner.
She should cook dinner.
Él debería limpiar.
He should clean up.
He should clean up.
He should clean up.
Deberías leer más.
You should read more.
You should read more.
You should read more.
Deberíamos practicar juntos.
We should practice together.
We should practice together.
We should practice together.
Deberían hacer preguntas.
They should ask questions.
They should ask questions.
They should ask questions.
Ella debería conducir despacio.
She should drive slowly.
She should drive slowly.
She should drive slowly.
Él debería descansar bien.
He should rest well.
He should rest well.
He should rest well.
Deberías ahorrar dinero.
You should save money.
You should save money.
You should save money.
Deberíamos trabajar duro.
We should work hard.
We should work hard.
We should work hard.
Deberían disfrutar la vida.
They should enjoy life.
They should enjoy life.
They should enjoy life.
Ella debería mantenerse tranquila.
She should stay calm.
She should stay calm.
She should stay calm.
Él debería respetar a los demás.
He should respect others.
He should respect others.
He should respect others.
Deberías pensar positivamente.
You should think positively.
You should think positively.
You should think positively.
Deberíamos seguir siendo amigos.
We should remain friends.
We should remain friends.
We should remain friends.
Deberían planificar con anticipación.
They should plan ahead.
They should plan ahead.
They should plan ahead.
Ella debería terminar rápido.
She should finish quickly.
She should finish quickly.
She should finish quickly.
Él debería hablar claramente.
He should speak clearly.
He should speak clearly.
He should speak clearly.
Deberías disculparte sinceramente.
You should apologize sincerely.
You should apologize sincerely.
You should apologize sincerely.
Deberíamos jugar limpio.
We should play fair.
We should play fair.
We should play fair.
Deberían ser puntuales.
They should be punctual.
They should be punctual.
They should be punctual.
Ella debería dejar de fumar.
She should stop smoking.
She should stop smoking.
She should stop smoking.
Él debería estudiar más.
He should study harder.
He should study harder.
He should study harder.
Deberías aprender a diario.
You should learn daily.
You should learn daily.
You should learn daily.
Deberíamos trabajar eficientemente.
We should work efficiently.
We should work efficiently.
We should work efficiently.
¿Deberían quererse a sí mismos?
They should love themselves.
They should love themselves.
They should love themselves.
Ella debería aceptar ayuda.
She should accept help.
She should accept help.
She should accept help.
Él debería actuar responsablemente.
He should act responsibly.
He should act responsibly.
He should act responsibly.
Deberías seguir las reglas.
You should follow rules.
You should follow rules.
You should follow rules.
Deberíamos comer juntos.
We should eat together.
We should eat together.
We should eat together.
Deberían sonreír a menudo.
They should smile often.
They should smile often.
They should smile often.
Ella debería confiar en sí misma.
She should trust herself.
She should trust herself.
She should trust herself.
Él debería esforzarse más.
He should try harder.
He should try harder.
He should try harder.
Podrías intentarlo de nuevo.
You could try again.
You could try again.
You could try again.
Podríamos ir ahora.
We could go now.
We could go now.
We could go now.
Ellos podrían aprender más.
They could learn more.
They could learn more.
They could learn more.
Ella podría visitar pronto.
She could visit soon.
She could visit soon.
She could visit soon.
Él podría quedarse más tiempo.
He could stay longer.
He could stay longer.
He could stay longer.
Podrías comer menos.
You could eat less.
You could eat less.
You could eat less.
Podríamos trabajar juntos.
We could work together.
We could work together.
We could work together.
Ellos podrían ayudarnos.
They could help us.
They could help us.
They could help us.
Ella podría llamarlo.
She could call him.
She could call him.
She could call him.
Él podría tocar la guitarra.
He could play guitar.
He could play guitar.
He could play guitar.
Podrías conducir hasta allí.
You could drive there.
You could drive there.
You could drive there.
Podríamos irnos temprano.
We could leave early.
We could leave early.
We could leave early.
Ellos podrían estudiar mucho.
They could study hard.
They could study hard.
They could study hard.
Ella podría dormir más.
She could sleep more.
She could sleep more.
She could sleep more.
Él podría caminar a casa.
He could walk home.
He could walk home.
He could walk home.
Podrías preguntarles.
You could ask them.
You could ask them.
You could ask them.
Podríamos ver televisión.
We could watch TV.
We could watch TV.
We could watch TV.
Ellos podrían estar en silencio.
They could be quiet.
They could be quiet.
They could be quiet.
Ella podría dibujar bien.
She could draw well.
She could draw well.
She could draw well.
Él podría ganar fácilmente.
He could win easily.
He could win easily.
He could win easily.
Podrías encontrarlo.
You could find it.
You could find it.
You could find it.
Podríamos viajar juntos.
We could travel together.
We could travel together.
We could travel together.
Ellos podrían correr más rápido.
They could run faster.
They could run faster.
They could run faster.
Ella podría cantar hermosamente.
She could sing beautifully.
She could sing beautifully.
She could sing beautifully.
Él podría arreglar eso.
He could fix that.
He could fix that.
He could fix that.
Podrías traer comida.
You could bring food.
You could bring food.
You could bring food.
Podríamos hacer la cena.
We could make dinner.
We could make dinner.
We could make dinner.
Ellos podrían comenzar temprano.
They could start early.
They could start early.
They could start early.
Ella podría practicar más.
She could practice more.
She could practice more.
She could practice more.
Él podría cocinar la cena.
He could cook dinner.
He could cook dinner.
He could cook dinner.
Podrías unirte a nosotros.
You could join us.
You could join us.
You could join us.
Podríamos nadar mañana.
We could swim tomorrow.
We could swim tomorrow.
We could swim tomorrow.
Ellos podrían escribir más.
They could write more.
They could write more.
They could write more.
Ella podría pintar hoy.
She could paint today.
She could paint today.
She could paint today.
Él podría hacer ejercicio a diario.
He could exercise daily.
He could exercise daily.
He could exercise daily.
Podrías ahorrar dinero.
You could save money.
You could save money.
You could save money.
Podríamos comprar boletos.
We could buy tickets.
We could buy tickets.
We could buy tickets.
Ellos podrían actuar amablemente.
They could act nicely.
They could act nicely.
They could act nicely.
Ella podría bailar bien.
She could dance well.
She could dance well.
She could dance well.
Él podría enseñarte.
He could teach you.
He could teach you.
He could teach you.
Podrías mejorar rápidamente.
You could improve quickly.
You could improve quickly.
You could improve quickly.
Podríamos estudiar juntos.
We could study together.
We could study together.
We could study together.
Ellos podrían terminar pronto.
They could finish soon.
They could finish soon.
They could finish soon.
Ella podría hornear galletas.
She could bake cookies.
She could bake cookies.
She could bake cookies.
Él podría visitar seguido.
He could visit often.
He could visit often.
He could visit often.
Podrías compartir ideas.
You could share ideas.
You could share ideas.
You could share ideas.
Podríamos resolver esto.
We could solve this.
We could solve this.
We could solve this.
Ellos podrían jugar ajedrez.
They could play chess.
They could play chess.
They could play chess.
Ella podría aprender fácilmente.
She could learn easily.
She could learn easily.
She could learn easily.
Él podría viajar solo.
He could travel alone.
He could travel alone.
He could travel alone.
Debes actuar ahora.
You must act now.
You must act now.
You must act now.
Debemos mantenernos enfocados.
We must stay focused.
We must stay focused.
We must stay focused.
Ellos deben esforzarse más.
They must try harder.
They must try harder.
They must try harder.
Ella debe llamarlo.
She must call him.
She must call him.
She must call him.
Él debe estar allí.
He must be there.
He must be there.
He must be there.
Debes estudiar más.
You must study more.
You must study more.
You must study more.
Debemos comer bien.
We must eat well.
We must eat well.
We must eat well.
Ellos deben llegar temprano.
They must arrive early.
They must arrive early.
They must arrive early.
Ella debe beber agua.
She must drink water.
She must drink water.
She must drink water.
Él debe conducir con seguridad.
He must drive safely.
He must drive safely.
He must drive safely.
Debes escuchar atentamente.
You must listen carefully.
You must listen carefully.
You must listen carefully.
Debemos respetar a todos.
We must respect everyone.
We must respect everyone.
We must respect everyone.
Ellos deben mantener la calma.
They must stay calm.
They must stay calm.
They must stay calm.
Ella debe descansar bien.
She must rest well.
She must rest well.
She must rest well.
Él debe aprender rápidamente.
He must learn quickly.
He must learn quickly.
He must learn quickly.
Debes trabajar duro.
You must work hard.
You must work hard.
You must work hard.
Debemos seguir las reglas.
We must follow rules.
We must follow rules.
We must follow rules.
Ellos deben ser honestos.
They must be honest.
They must be honest.
They must be honest.
Ella debe ayudar a otros.
She must help others.
She must help others.
She must help others.
Él debe practicar a diario.
He must practice daily.
He must practice daily.
He must practice daily.
Debes pensar con claridad.
You must think clearly.
You must think clearly.
You must think clearly.
Debemos permanecer fuertes.
We must remain strong.
We must remain strong.
We must remain strong.
Ellos deben ahorrar dinero.
They must save money.
They must save money.
They must save money.
Ella debe completar esto.
She must complete this.
She must complete this.
She must complete this.
Él debe estar en silencio.
He must keep quiet.
He must keep quiet.
He must keep quiet.
Debes intentarlo de nuevo.
You must try again.
You must try again.
You must try again.
Debemos mantenernos positivos.
We must stay positive.
We must stay positive.
We must stay positive.
Ellos deben irse pronto.
They must leave soon.
They must leave soon.
They must leave soon.
Ella debe disculparse sinceramente.
She must apologize sincerely.
She must apologize sincerely.
She must apologize sincerely.
Él debe terminar el trabajo.
He must finish work.
He must finish work.
He must finish work.
Debes confiar en ti mismo.
You must trust yourself.
You must trust yourself.
You must trust yourself.
Debemos actuar de manera responsable.
We must act responsibly.
We must act responsibly.
We must act responsibly.
Ellos deben respetar la naturaleza.
They must respect nature.
They must respect nature.
They must respect nature.
Ella debe traer comida.
She must bring food.
She must bring food.
She must bring food.
Él debe preguntar amablemente.
He must ask politely.
He must ask politely.
He must ask politely.
Debes mantenerte informado.
You must stay informed.
You must stay informed.
You must stay informed.
Debemos encontrar soluciones.
We must find solutions.
We must find solutions.
We must find solutions.
Ellos deben hablar con sinceridad.
They must speak truthfully.
They must speak truthfully.
They must speak truthfully.
Ella debe limpiar.
She must clean up.
She must clean up.
She must clean up.
Él debe mantenerse alerta.
He must stay alert.
He must stay alert.
He must stay alert.
Debes responder honestamente.
You must answer honestly.
You must answer honestly.
You must answer honestly.
Debemos planificar con anticipación.
We must plan ahead.
We must plan ahead.
We must plan ahead.
Ellos deben perdonar errores.
They must forgive mistakes.
They must forgive mistakes.
They must forgive mistakes.
Ella debe usar guantes.
She must wear gloves.
She must wear gloves.
She must wear gloves.
Él debe ser puntual.
He must be punctual.
He must be punctual.
He must be punctual.
Debes mostrar respeto.
You must show respect.
You must show respect.
You must show respect.
Debemos cooperar plenamente.
We must cooperate fully.
We must cooperate fully.
We must cooperate fully.
Ellos deben evitar conflictos.
They must avoid conflict.
They must avoid conflict.
They must avoid conflict.
Ella debe establecer metas.
She must set goals.
She must set goals.
She must set goals.
Él debe prestar atención.
He must pay attention.
He must pay attention.
He must pay attention.
Debes estudiar.
You ought to study.
You ought to study.
You ought to study.
Debemos irnos.
We ought to leave.
We ought to leave.
We ought to leave.
Ellos deben ayudar.
They ought to help.
They ought to help.
They ought to help.
Ella debe intentar.
She ought to try.
She ought to try.
She ought to try.
Él debe descansar.
He ought to rest.
He ought to rest.
He ought to rest.
Debes escuchar.
You ought to listen.
You ought to listen.
You ought to listen.
Debemos prepararnos.
We ought to prepare.
We ought to prepare.
We ought to prepare.
Ellos deben esperar.
They ought to wait.
They ought to wait.
They ought to wait.
Ella debe disculparse.
She ought to apologize.
She ought to apologize.
She ought to apologize.
Él debe practicar.
He ought to practice.
He ought to practice.
He ought to practice.
Debes mejorar.
You ought to improve.
You ought to improve.
You ought to improve.
Debemos ahorrar.
We ought to save.
We ought to save.
We ought to save.
Ellos deben relajarse.
They ought to relax.
They ought to relax.
They ought to relax.
Ella debe hacer ejercicio.
She ought to exercise.
She ought to exercise.
She ought to exercise.
Él debe aprender.
He ought to learn.
He ought to learn.
He ought to learn.
Debes decir.
You ought to decide.
You ought to decide.
You ought to decide.
Debemos estar de acuerdo.
We ought to agree.
We ought to agree.
We ought to agree.
Ellos deben comunicarse.
They ought to communicate.
They ought to communicate.
They ought to communicate.
Ella debe conducir.
She ought to drive.
She ought to drive.
She ought to drive.
Él debe regresar.
He ought to return.
He ought to return.
He ought to return.
Debes quedarte.
You ought to stay.
You ought to stay.
You ought to stay.
Debemos recordar.
We ought to remember.
We ought to remember.
We ought to remember.
Ellos deben enfocarse.
They ought to focus.
They ought to focus.
They ought to focus.
Ella debe llamar.
She ought to call.
She ought to call.
She ought to call.
Él debe ser.
He ought to be.
He ought to be.
He ought to be.
Debes llegar.
You ought to arrive.
You ought to arrive.
You ought to arrive.
Debemos organizar.
We ought to organize.
We ought to organize.
We ought to organize.
Ellos deben pagar.
They ought to pay.
They ought to pay.
They ought to pay.
Ella debe escuchar.
She ought to listen.
She ought to listen.
She ought to listen.
Él debe sonreír.
He ought to smile.
He ought to smile.
He ought to smile.
Debes comer.
You ought to eat.
You ought to eat.
You ought to eat.
Debemos actuar.
We ought to act.
We ought to act.
We ought to act.
Ellos deben apoyar.
They ought to support.
They ought to support.
They ought to support.
Ella debe cambiar.
She ought to change.
She ought to change.
She ought to change.
Él debe escribir.
He ought to write.
He ought to write.
He ought to write.
Debes relajarte.
You ought to relax.
You ought to relax.
You ought to relax.
Debemos disculparnos.
We ought to apologize.
We ought to apologize.
We ought to apologize.
Ellos deben terminar.
They ought to finish.
They ought to finish.
They ought to finish.
Ella debe estudiar.
She ought to study.
She ought to study.
She ought to study.
Él debe mejorar.
He ought to improve.
He ought to improve.
He ought to improve.
Debes compartir.
You ought to share.
You ought to share.
You ought to share.
Debemos enfocarnos.
We ought to focus.
We ought to focus.
We ought to focus.
Ellos deben responder.
They ought to respond.
They ought to respond.
They ought to respond.
Ella debe disfrutar.
She ought to enjoy.
She ought to enjoy.
She ought to enjoy.
Él debe leer.
He ought to read.
He ought to read.
He ought to read.
Debes descansar.
You ought to rest.
You ought to rest.
You ought to rest.
Debemos trabajar.
We ought to work.
We ought to work.
We ought to work.
Ellos deben pensar.
They ought to think.
They ought to think.
They ought to think.
Ella debe esperar.
She ought to wait.
She ought to wait.
She ought to wait.
Él debe continuar.
He ought to continue.
He ought to continue.
He ought to continue.